So we're going to start by looking at another example that we've been looking at with two-way tables, and then I'm going to go back and give you some specific vocabulary that you're going to want to know for some of these tables. So first it says, in an experiment to test the effectiveness of vitamin C on the length of colds, two groups of people with colds were given a pill to take once a day. The pill for one of the groups contains 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, while the other group takes a placebo pill. The researcher recorded the results in the table. So here's the results of group A, group B, a cold that lasts less than a week and a cold that lasts more than a week. First, the researcher wanted to know what percentage to the nearest whole percent of people are in the combination of each category. So 14% of all the participants had a cold that lasted less than a week and were in group A. What percentage of all of the participants had a cold that lasted less than a week and are in group B, and then continue filling in the table. So a couple things I want to do before we start. I'm going to need some of the totals here. So if you notice, the totals are not given in this two-way table. So I want to first go ahead and calculate those totals. So how many were in group A? I would add those two numbers together. I get 33. Group B is 80. And then totals going this way as well. So cold that lasted less than a week is 43, more than a week is 70. And so then in total, if I add this way, I get 113 people. So now that I have my totals, I want to look at what this information is doing. So it's saying that 14% of all the participants. So out of all 113 participants, 14% fell into this right here. So what that means is that 16 out of 113 should be 14%. So if you divide these numbers, get your decimal, multiply by 100, you will get 14%. Now you have to round because you get a decimal, but you get 14% if you round. So I'm going to do the same thing for the rest of these. So for example, in this one, it would be 17 out of my 113 total, 27, and then 53. And so I'm going to grab my calculator real quick. I'm going to calculate these percentages. You'll see from what we've calculated here that these percentages were out of this big total down here at the bottom. So this is 100% when I add all my totals together. So this is out of your entire total, and that's going to be important here when we look at the different ways that these relative frequency tables are created, because in the next example it says, next the researchers noticed that among participants who had colds that lasted less than a week, 37% were in group A. Among participants who had cold that lasted more than a week, what percentage were in group B? So we know this percentage was 37%, so I want to try to figure out how they got 37% by looking at what they were referencing. So it says that among the participants who had a cold that lasted less than a week. So less than a week, if we go back up here, was 43 was our total. So now we're looking at our totals out of our rows. So we want to do 16 out of the 43. So down here it'll be 16 out of 43. And when you calculate that to get your percent, you do get 37%. So I still want to do the same thing for group B. So it'd be 27 out of my total of 43. That I get 63%, which these should now add to 100% in this total because I'm doing it in relation to the row total. So now I want to do the second row as well with relation to the total of 70. So I'll do 17 out of 70 and 53 out of 70. I'll fill them out. So in relation to the rows, or how long the cold has lasted, these are the percentages that I get. This example says, finally, the researchers noticed that among the participants in group A, 48% had colds that lasted less than a week. So I know this time I'm looking at my total from group A, and if we go back to our original, our total from group A was 33 people. So out of 33 people, 16 of those people. So I'm going to say 16 out of 33 is what they're referencing. So it says that 48% of those had a cold that lasted less than a week. Among the participants in group B, how many had a cold that lasted a week or more? So we also want to look in group B and see out of those totals. So when I calculate this percentage, divide those and multiply by 100, I do get a rounded 48%. And then I could do the same thing for polls that lasted for more than a week, but there were 17 people in that group. So I'm going to do 17 out of the total of 33. And then I'll do the same thing for group B, but now my total is there's 80 people. So it'll be 27 out of 80 and 53 out of 80. So now you can see that since I had my totals for my columns is what I was going out of, then 100% should be added when I add the two percentages in my columns together. I want to go back and give you a little bit of vocabulary that you might hear come up so that you'll know in case you hear it. This table is just called a two-way frequency table, so just your typical frequency table. But the pieces of the table have different names. So the numbers inside here that join two ideas together, so join group A and colds that last than a week that join those together, they're called joint frequencies. And the ones on the outside, the totals, are actually called marginal frequencies. And I always remember this because joint sounds like you're joining two ideas together, so they're the joining pieces. Marginal, think about the margins of a paper, the ones that are on the edge, so the totals on the outside are the margins. So then when we have this table, we've talked about before, that this is a relative frequency table. Now this one is just a typical, just plain old, if you just hear relative frequency table and it doesn't give you anything specific about your totals and what it's out of, and it's talking out of the entire total, then it's just a relative frequency table. But once we get into more specifics, where this one was now out of the rows, this is called a conditional. This is called conditional relative frequency. So it's relative frequency because it's relative to something. So it's 16 out of the 43, so relative to the total of 43, but it's conditional because it's given the condition that we knew that the person had a cold that lasted less than a week. I want to know how many percent are in group A and group B. Or given that it lasted more than a week, I want to know how many are group A or group B. This one is also conditional relative frequency, but we went by the columns. So we know that out of our total of people who are in group A, so if you're in group A, 48% of them had a cold that lasted less than a week, which is different than over here. This one says, if you had a cold that lasted less than a week, then 37% of you are in group A. So it's a little tricky depending on the totals that you're looking out of. So you can look out of your rows for conditional, you can look out of your columns for conditional, or you could just have a general relative frequency table that deals with the joint and the marginal numbers out of your total.